Good morning. This is a joint hearing of House Education and House Ways and Means. We are here with folks from the Agency of Education to dive deeper into particular situation of special education, both because it is one of the more fast-growing expenses in the education fund. It's a great example of past reforms that we have tried to do that have not gone exactly as we anticipated. And it is a place in the foundation formula that we think a little more work is, well, I guess more work is needed on all of it, but it's an area of the foundation formula we'd like to do some more work on. So glad to have folks here from AUE, and I'm happy to turn it over to you, and then we can make sure we have lots of time for questions.
Good morning, folks. For the record, Jill Briggs-Campbell, Interim Deputy Secretary. Unfortunately, Zoe was not able to attend. She had an emergency that came up about half an hour ago, so she asked me to step in. I'll let the agency folks, both here and in virtual land, introduce themselves, and then we also have two of our kind of partners, our experts from APA. So you all know Justin and Amanda from APA, and then we're also joined by Nate Levinson from New Solutions, who has a great deal of experience in special education in Vermont as well. So Meg, I'll kick it over to you.
Hi, good morning. For the record, I'm Meg Porcella. I'm the Director of the Student Support Services Division at the Agency of Education, and that division houses the special education.
And Sean?
I'm Sean Cousineau, the interim CFO at AOE.
And Cassie, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. Cassie Santo, State Director of Special Education.
And Amanda and Justin, if you'd like to introduce yourselves.
Justin Silverstein with APA Consulting.
Amanda Brown, also with APA.
And Nate, last but not least.
Sure. Good morning, Nate Levinson, New Solutions K-12.
So I can just provide some brief kind of opening and framing remarks, and then I'll kick it off to the agency team. So as we've indicated, and I think as Rep. Kornheiser kind of laid out, special education is a major area of strategic focus for the Agency of Education, both in sort of completing the implementation of Act 173, but also as we look forward to education information in whatever form that sort of arrives at in this building. We have really focused on the fact that we recognize that special education is a major cost driver in our system, but also that in order to address those pressures on the education funding system, we first and sort of foremost have to improve the quality of delivery in terms of special education across the state. And so Meg and Cassie will be speaking to the work that's well underway to support kind of that improvement of quality. We, as Rep. Kornheiser signaled in the proposal for the foundation formula, we were very transparent that we had sort of bracketed out special education with a recognition of carrying some of those costs while that work is being done, because it's critical that we're not undermining and cutting from that system as the transformation and sort of improvement of quality is happening across the system. I'd also signal that it's long been diagnosed in the state that there is an issue of scale as well. So whatever that scale is, that, as I said, whatever sort of is landed on in this building, there is a recognition that operating at our current scale, it's very challenging for districts and schools to attract special educators, to be able to provide professional development for the general ed classroom instructors, and we'll be talking a lot about that today, for having sort of statewide and regional resources to improve the quality of special education. The folks in this building really recognizing that, passed the BOCES bill last year, and that work is underway. We actually just received our first draft articles of agreement earlier this week from one of the proposed BOCES. So we're actually in the process of reviewing that. So I think as we're having this conversation about funding and scale, really, again, that three-legged stool of really keeping quality front and center. So what we're going to be talking about today is an overview of special education funding, which Sean will be leading, and Amanda, we may sort of call on you to offer any clarification as we're working through the slides. And then Meg and Cassie will be really talking about how are we going to achieve that quality delivery of special education, and sort of improving our overall delivery of education, and what is the work that's already underway in the agency and in the field. Just as with many of our other initiatives, we have systems that are doing this well. So as we saw with literacy, we had some systems that were really ahead of folks in terms of improving literacy instruction. With chronic absenteeism, we've been able to identify those systems as well. We know that there's some systems in the state that are more effective at this. And we do have some other models, and Nate Levinson can speak to this further on in the conversation, of states who actually took our work and implemented it. So we can get a sense of how did they achieve that, but then also what have the results been. So part of the work that we need to do is really identifying which systems are doing this effectively, how are we measuring that, and then how do we amplify and bring that to scale. As you heard us talk ad nauseum for the last couple of months, is that one of the critical issues in the system of education is we have real disparities in terms of quality across kind of the whole state. How do we actually use scale, use governance and funding and support to ensure that that quality is happening everywhere? So I will stop talking at this point. Sean, I'm going to pass over to you, and if you can project for the people behind you as well. I apologize for the folks who are behind us.
There's also a wild extra white noise situation.
There is happening right there. Yeah.
Okay, we've got 3 or 4 slides on special ed expenditures. The first one we're showing shows the percentage of special ed students overall in the state from FY20, a slight increase going up to 18.6% 2 years ago. The next slide, we have special ed spending.
Whoa, yeah.
As you go through, can you put this in the context of national data? I mean, I know Vermont is not as economically disadvantaged as many other states, but we have a higher rate of identification. And I wondered if you could speak to the trends in our data and what that might say.
I can't talk on national levels. Others might be able to. Okay.
So can we run through sort of this section, pause for questions? Is that an effective way to do this? Are you okay with that?
Yes, and I think the question about putting this in context, both of national data and national action, not trends, like the way the world is changing very fast, political actions.
Okay, do you mean like DC context?
Yes.
Okay, great.
So those 2 things, if that's not something that can happen today, can we sort of follow up on that would be really helpful.
Okay, do that.
Okay. So this next slide shows this special ed spending per special ed student. And it also shows the source of the funding. So we're looking at just over 90% coming from state and local money, mostly state money, I would say. Federal has about 8%, and then there's a small portion of other funding that the districts use to fund education or special education. And it looks like in FY23, the school district spent $437.5 million on special ed.
What does local money mean in this context?
When we, in the Uniform Chart of Accounts, we kind of lump together state and local money. There's really very little local money, I would say. Districts may categorize tuition they're getting from other districts as local.
But they might not.
Yeah, I'm not sure. That was just an example that came up. So we don't really have a way to break it out because we we show it, the code that tracks the type of funding is called state.
Okay.
We'd have to dig into it through a different code probably to show it. But
Okay, I just have no sense of what local, like what any examples of local might mean in terms of funding, and so that's where my confusion
yeah,
lies.
This is
Good.
Amanda Brown. I would say, give us just a couple slides. We have a slide on funding sources for special education that I think can give some little more context for that. But local can include things like tuition, as Sean mentioned. It can also be just funding that they're using out of their general fund. So education fund dollars that they are using for special education services. So there are a series of funds that are targeted for special education. But when there's a gap in what they have available from, say, state and federal funding sources, they are then supplementing with local dollars. So again, tuition, general education fund dollars for special.
I'm happy to go on. I'm confused by the use of the word could rather than something more definitive.
yeah.
Because that like sort of the possibility that something might be something definitionally doesn't get me any closer to understanding what it is. I'm sorry.
No, that's a great
and the
question,
idea
and it
of-
is a do. Sorry, I shouldn't
Okay.
use could.
Thank
It
you.
is. More
And
specific.
the differentiation between what I hear you saying, Amanda, is a differentiation between local and state funding, is differentiation between education spending and ed fund spending that's not education spending. And that is not what I think of as local spending. So that is, if that is what you're saying, that is, I think, helpful context for us to set
Yeah.
before we launch into this.
Yeah, so I would say it's in most states you are making a strong distinction between what's state and local. That doesn't
I
happen
understand that.
in Vermont because of the way your funding system works. So this slide in particular was just to try to identify that very little of your special education funding is funded by the federal IDA funds, and the remainder is picked up from essentially all dollars in Vermont are state dollars, but state/local.
Okay, thank you.
So can I ask a question? I mean, because this is one of those places where the complexity of our system always boggles my mind. But so when we're talking about special education funding, we're talking about, in my mind, 3 different buckets. We're talking about federal dollars, IDEA, et cetera. We're talking about what I called our categorical sort of state block grants, right? So the census block, there's essential early childhood, there's a few other things, right? State placed students. And then there are the decisions that are made in the development of local budgets that get voted on at town meeting day, that are in some ways making up the gap between the actual cost of providing special education and what the sort of state categorical grants and the federal grants are providing.
So I think you left out the category of the extraordinary special education, which is one of the fastest growing areas. And so
yeah,
I think if we are looking at redoing all of the financing, making sure we're clear on all, I've lost count. Are we at 5 buckets? You were starting with 4 and I added 1, 5. It's 5 buckets, right?
Yeah.
So education spending, extraordinary, block grants, federal.
Here's a nice list.
Yep. No, that's what I was gonna say. We do have a slide here that shows what we bucketed as 4. I think you could make your buckets a little different, but your IDA is that top one. Your state special education formula grants, which for FY25 total about 265 million, which includes that census block grant, the extraordinary reimbursement. Then there's some other grants that are in there, but your census block and your extraordinary are the 2 biggest one. There's other state grants outside of the formula grants for special ed, including the early childhood special education, or EEE is another way it's referred to, of about 9 million. And then there is another allocation for state placed students for the special education costs specifically for those students. So those are 2 other state grants that outside of the formula grants that target special education. Then other sources of funding used, which is getting into that what else is in that state and local category. General fund, which would be when we say general fund, we mean districts' general funds or SU's general funds, not the state's general fund. So this is really your education fund dollars. Tuition, they're also using Medicaid for another federal source that's being used, and then other state grants. So looking at the data, I've seen things like Flexible Pathways has shown up, and a couple other state grants that are for purposes that are not specifically for special education, but can be used on special education students. So those are what's making up the, as Jill was saying, that gap between what are they spending on special education and what are the funds that are specifically directed either federal or state for special education.
So this is the education funding ecosystem to support the provision of special education services.
And I didn't mean to derail the presentation. I wanted to define terms as we started, and I'm gonna give it back to you, Sean.
Can I ask, are there questions? Because I'm seeing a lot of, at the corner of my eye, what seems like a lot of questions. So if we need to establish some basics.
No, I think we're good.
Okay.
Thank you, Sean.
Okay.
Oh, sorry, you're like way in that corner, Margie. I'm so sorry. Go ahead.
Can you give me a definition, maybe general or maybe specific, what you mean by special education expenditures? Are we talking about the personnel that are involved with students who are identified?
Students with IEPs.
I'm sorry,
Students with an IEP, an individualized education plan, an
so the personnel, and are there other services that are related to working with those students?
Yes. So consulting services, the case management, all sorts of various things.
Speech language
Technology.
pathologist, the behavioral, the BCBA. Sorry, I shouldn't be speaking in acronyms, but that's where my brain went. Like, so, so those interventionists could also fall into that category.
Working with those particular students.
Yeah, and I think it's always important. We're going to be talking about two things today. We're talking about funding, which is very much grounded in codes, accounting codes, right? So how do we identify what a special education cost is if it's coded as such in district accounting, right? And they're supposed to be using the Uniform Chart of Accounts, right? And they code things to special education. So we're not guessing that it's for a special education service. The districts are the ones telling us that it's a cost for special education. And then on the flip side, there's the programmatic activities that support students on IEPs. And that can be a whole variety of things. So we have to sort of talk about both things today. When we're talking about these slides, we're talking about what is coded as such in sort of the accounting systems. Does that help to distinguish a little bit?
That helps. Okay.
Okay, I'll back up one. I think this is the one we skipped. So this slide shows what the percentage is of special ed spending versus overall spending at the districts. And there was a drop in 20, and we've kind of stayed kind of level at 19% for the last 3 years. So even though special ed spending is going up, it's keeping, I guess, pace with the overall spending for education.
At the district level.
Yes, yeah. And I think we already talked about this slide. And that's it for the finance data slides anyways.
Do we want to pause for questions around the actual kind of funding?
I think we're good. Thank you.
Yeah, and I was actually going to, Amanda, do you have anything you want to add? I know you've been very deep in the weeds on some of this data.
No, I think we've covered it well. The only thing I was going to add on when we look at, say, special education costs as a percentage of budgets, to keep in mind just during this window is when there was a lot of extra federal dollars through ESSER that were available that weren't necessarily targeting special education. So as we go forward, we may see that special education is a larger piece of the budget once those dollars come away. But so I think, Jill, you reiterated really well where the data was coming from for those pieces. So the first couple slides were thinking about what is being spent and coded for special education. This slide is then focused on what is the state and the federal government appropriating for special education services, and starting to think about, as you build a funding system, what's that differential between what's being spent in your districts and your SUs and SDs versus the funding that's available.
And is there a sort of a slide that pairs the previous slides with this one, which is how much is spent out of each of these funding sources, and how has that changed?
We do not have that available right now, but we could follow up with more detail there, making that comparison.
So I want to make sure we have the data request. So for each of the sort of funding ecosystem, you'd be interested in trend lines?
Yeah, I think a lot of very early on in this conversation, perhaps even before we began a conversation about the governor's transformation proposal, we were concerned about extraordinary special education as just one piece of this, and getting closer to the roots of why those costs have gone up so much.
And are we going
I think
to,
in the federal context, there's a question about how much of this is Medicaid dependent, but I think all of that would be. And then if we're gonna redo formulas,
Yeah.
understanding how each of the pieces of the existing formula apply to the overall spending would be very helpful, including how much district general fund dollars outside of these grants are spent on it.
and we have sort of we've been working with business managers to refine that number, that district number, and ensuring that we're all working from kind of the same data set and analysis. So we're actually deep into that right now with some business managers. And just that reminder, in terms of the COVID era funds, we are now living this year, the budget, when those funds expired in September. So we don't have an answer yet for what does this look like, because we're actually living that budget right now, but we'll be able to do that additional analysis. Okay, so I have that as a.
Madam Chair, I was hoping we could also just amend the data request a little bit, because as you said so clearly, the services are driven by the IEPs. And so the school districts are obligated to provide the IEPs services. And the state is currently using education dollars as the state match to pull down Medicaid. And it would be very helpful to know actually how much Medicaid we are pulling down by using ed funds as the state match, and how that's been changing over time, because that is a contractual obligation. If those funds are removed, all of those costs are going to come back on the education fund. So I actually think we actually do need those dollars as well. And also, it would be helpful to know how the decision to shift from bundled services to bundled rates has impacted the ed fund as well, with respect to allocating the DAs.
Okay, that's really helpful.
From the designated agency.
See if I can interpret my own handwriting later, but.
Thank you.
Okay.
So when I was asked to prepare just a couple of things, Secretary Saunders wanted me to talk about Act 173 of 2018 and how that fits into the conversation that we're having and where we are, especially in my division of student support services, in improving outcomes for students with IEPs, but then all students who have who struggle, who need additional supports around things. So it's like a jump cut to a completely type of different set of thoughts if we're ready to move on. Okay.
The sort of the programmatic, how do we ensure and improve quality?
Yep.
Yeah.
And so sorry to ask this, but it
It's pretty
loud.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was like, I've never known you to be quiet.
Thank you so much.
Doing
Secretary.
measure.
I really appreciate that. Definitely. So I'm starting with a very old slide that came from the district management group way back in 2019 when the district management group's report came out, I think right after Act 173 was enacted. And this slide is important because it shows in this Venn diagram when we talk about students who need additional support, we are talking about students with IEPs, but we're also talking about a lot of other students. And the important distinction is, even though we are talking about special education funding, the need to support all kids doesn't live in special education alone. And so that's what this slide sort of exemplifies, and it undergirds where we are with the goals of Act 173 and making sure we're supporting all kids. So with students who struggle to read and comprehend, students who have skill deficits from the prior grades, many, we need multiple modes of instruction. Many learn and process information in different ways. We know there is no standard brain, right? All brains are unique. So that's sort of what this slide shows us. If I do that, is that? Yeah. Okay. So then the district management group put out their report, and we came away with these 5 best practices. And these, we didn't, they did, they outlined these. But these best practices are ones that those of us who are in education, we read and go, yes, we recognize that this confirms what a lot of us teachers, educators, we know that core instruction, the instruction that happens in the classroom, needs to be designed so that it meets the needs of most students. Additional instructional time, intervention, that additional instruction needs to happen outside of the core instruction, not in lieu of. It needs to be in addition to. And also for for all kids, it shouldn't also take the place of a special or recess, but be built into the schedule so that is an additional instructional time. Students who struggle need to receive their instruction from highly skilled teachers. The instruction needs to happen from highly skilled personnel. There needs to be a systems-wide support to supporting positive student behaviors. And also the student with the most intensive needs need to have that specialized instruction from skilled and trained experts. So that goes to the additional service providers that we're talking about. So these 5 things, we recognize that they're important. They are part of our education quality standards because it's just good practice. But these 5 best practices, we called them the DMG opportunities, and we still use them today to make sure that when we're providing technical assistance or we're talking about what's important to us at the AOE, they always go back to some of these, and you'll hear many of these echoed in the current policies that the AOE is rolling out. So in very simple terms, there were some 4-ish goals of Act 173. The big one is to ensure that all students who struggle are provided with best practices in instruction and intervention by highly skilled educators. So that means ensuring that there is a viable curriculum that systems, districts, and schools and classrooms are using formative assessment, are using assessments formatively, that there's a strong assessment system, that those assessments are used to provide actionable feedback, that student progress data is being collected and used to improve outcomes for all students. So the second one was reduce the need for special education evaluations and paperwork. And this would result from, if we are able to implement well those 5 district management group practices, then more students who struggle would be identified and helped and served in those gen ed spaces and wouldn't need to have that special education evaluation. The mindset shift of in order for a student to receive some kind of special intervention, they first need to be evaluated and given an IEP is not accurate. Like we can intervene right away and be proactive. And that was part of Act 173's goals. Act 173 changed our funding model from a reimbursement to a census block grant, and that was the first part of the conversation. And then Act 173 also gave us the opportunity to open rules, special education rules and independent school rules. And the result was the special ed rules were opened and several changes were made, and same thing with our independent schools. Oh, I'm so sorry.
I did watch a state board meeting, and what came out of the state board meeting is that the state board had revised the rules for independent schools to require them to either have a special educator under contract or to have a special educator on staff.
Yes.
And the agency implemented an alternative process that just required them to watch a module, or somebody on site to watch a module and then self-attest that they were ready. And I believe that it had indicated it would revise that practice to conform with the rule. And I wonder if you could tell us how many schools may have been approved to receive students with disabilities who didn't either have a special educator on staff or a special educator under contract, and whether that situation has been resolved or is still funding schools that don't meet the rules.
I'm not able to answer that question directly. I don't have that data in front of me. I will say that the pause that happened in our, what's the word I'm looking for?
The approval process?
The approval process, thank you very much, for independent schools will be able for us to address exactly what you're talking about. Because I actually believe that we have like the pause that's happened gets at what you're referring to.
But to confirm, we may currently funding schools that do not meet the standard of either having a special educator on board.
On board, yeah.
Yeah,
Well,
so-
I'm very happy to check into that.
And maybe if you could also tell us what risk that puts LEAs at, because they're counting on agency too, and it's that approval, but who is liable if a student's IEP is not met in these settings?
Right, so the LEA is responsible for ensuring, but the state is ultimately liable. It's our job to make sure that the LEAs are meeting the needs of all students' IEPs.
So I think that we could do a follow-up in
Absolutely.
going back to our independent school team and getting the specific data that you were requesting. And then we can follow up.
That's the one follow-up. Now, could you confirm, my understanding is that wherever students are placed, we're required to provide them with access to free and appropriate public education. Is that correct?
Indeed.
And so if we are placing a student in a school that does not conform to the education quality standards, can we know that those students have access to FAPE?
Can I ask a clarifying question? So FAPE and education quality standards to me are two different sets. Can you?
The education quality standards is our definition of public education in rule. And so that is what we are guaranteed to provide students in the public school. In our statute, or in our current rule, we hold independent schools accountable to a basic minimum standard that was set in the 80s and is not equivalent to the education quality standards. Some independent schools far exceed that, some do not. And my question is, if we are placing students in schools that do not meet the education quality standards, can we say that we are providing those students with access to FAPE? I could help them get an answer to that. And in that vein, when we place students, like we have some issues, I know we only see the ones that are in the paper, but for example, when we have closed, my understanding is that they didn't have a special educator on staff. And how do we provide, in therapeutic for-profit settings, how do we provide students with access to the kinds of specialized instruction that you're talking about in 173 if they don't even have a special educator on staff in a therapeutic setting?
Yeah, so the answer for our current state, or what has happened over the past 3 years, happy to see what data we have. I can say that for where we are now and moving forward, that is absolutely something that our state director will be talking about, because we are developing processes for ensuring that our students on IEPs who are placed in independent school therapeutic setting.
I think my question is different. If the rules don't conform to federal law, how can your processes conform to federal law? I think that's the question I'm asking you.
I think it's worthwhile for us to
Yeah.
provide some written testimony on that. And just sort of that reminder of kind of my opening remarks was that Secretary Saunders has identified the improvement around special education, including independent schools, as an area of strategic focus for the agency. And so it might be helpful then to move to, as you move through your comments, to then hear from our state director on special education and the steps that we're taking right now. And then we can also circle back around on independent schools, because we have actually taken significant steps to make improvements to that process that are underway. So you can provide an update, different topic.
I was around for the creation of Act 173. I'm a big believer in it. And as I look at sort of the 4 goals, I know we did 3 and 4. But has it lived up to its promise to reduce the need for special education evaluation and paperwork? I mean, the whole idea was to pull away from the bead counting that went on and to be able to target the block grants at all students who might be struggling. Just anecdotally, what I hear is the bead counting still has to go on, and that sort of goal has not been met.
And I actually had it in my notes, but didn't say out loud. One of the things that we were not able to promise was that our federal bean counting, we aren't allowed to change to that point. So I think that there might, anecdotally also, there might have been a conflation between what we were able to say you don't have to do paperwork wise and what the reality was. I will say though that to that point, number 2, the work that we began is work that we're still trying to make more actionable, for sure.
My understanding actually was to remove bean counting, including the federal bean counting.
But we can't, we don't have that's not available to us. We can't undo, we can't ignore the federal rules.
But I do think that what Meg was sort of pointing out earlier is that we have as Rep. Holcomb pointed out, a fairly high identification rate in the state. And also Act 173 is not solely about special education. It's about supporting all students who struggle. And that by putting in place these best practices, my understanding is the theory of action is you would actually reduce the number of students to go through the identification process for an individual education plan, right? That would also reduce bean counting. We also are having multiple conversations right now. There's also IT debt and data infrastructure across the system, right? Again, complexity, a lot of different district systems, integration that's happening at the state level, and what can we plan for as part of moving to a more efficient and streamlined scale that would also reduce the kind of administrative burden down at the district level. So those are also like nuts and bolts mechanical issues that we need to address. I mean the collective we. I don't mean the agency. I mean we as a system have many, many different data systems that are not, the plumbing isn't hooked up. They're not integrated with each other in ways that create a lot of administrative burden. Very brief example is our Medicaid system and our IEP system. In none of our districts is talking to each other. So the work that the Medicaid program person is doing here, there is other work that's happening over here on IEPs. Those two systems don't talk to each other. We should be able to make improvements in that area. We're having those conversations now. But that also involves the districts. So we, the collectively, have work to do to integrate our data systems and improve them. And there's a lot of just technical debt.
Going back to 173. So we had a question about the intense school rules. We've had a question about the bean counting. Has there been more sort of, I don't want to call it prevention, but early intervention, thank you. Has that resulted in having fewer students identified?
We had our data on the percent of students that were identified at the beginning. I think it's going up.
I think your question is predicated on, can we say that there's been a proactive or earlier, like has core instruction improved in simple terms? And I don't know that we can say that. I think that we're coming out from the pandemic.
Yeah.
And the proposal, moving forward, I think that's why when Secretary Saunders started, it was an urgent, emergent sense around education. And so I think these are all tied in together.
I think I'm asking because often I think one of the hardest things in our work is that, well, most of the time we don't even know if something actually worked or not that we did. And I think that's true in this case with 173. I think there's the next question of, did it not work because it wasn't implemented the way it was designed? Did it not work because the actual theory of change was incorrect? Did that not work because it wasn't funded adequately? Or did it not work because global forces are stronger than local forces? And the answer might be yes, all four. But I think we all have that sense, but it's a sense and it's not, I don't feel like we've had a deliberative discovery towards that sense.
Sure. I just wonder if saying that Act 173 implementation didn't work.
I don't want to say that either.
Because I just,
yes.
yeah, I think we can say that across Vermont, can we assure that the majority of students are receiving the education that they need in a core classroom? But I do know that what the intention of the current plan is to make sure that we're able to measure that. Because I think that to what Jill was talking about, we have data bits that come in around our education snapshot from multiple different places that maybe aren't all aligned to just a couple of targeted metrics. And that is something that we are wanting to address and adjust and change so that we can say, here's how we know what we're doing well, so that we're not just being lucky, that we're leading that. And I agree that being able to measure the goals of Act 173, I think we were getting there right before the pandemic hit, and then everything changed. And even our important buckets changed because of that. Not that I want to blame everything on the pandemic.
I mean, there's a lot changed.
Yeah. But I'm just thinking about, what was important to the things we were talking about at the AOE at the time.
I'm trying to, think that we're trying to get too many different things out of this hearing. One of them is, right? One of them is that we're engaged in massive education transformation. It would be good to have lessons learned from a previous education transformation to apply to this one. There's a second. How do we make sure that this education transformation actually meets the needs of special education students and funding, right? And then there's a third piece about just making sure that kids receiving special education services today and tomorrow are okay, right? Yeah, and that's a lot of purposes for one hearing, so I'm.
Yeah. And I think that maybe as we move over to when Cassie sort of speaking to the work that's underway, I think that may actually help us, right? So as we sort of move from a historical perspective and the state of the state and where we are now, I think it's helpful to then pivot again. This is an area of strategic prioritization for leadership in the agency. And here is the work that is underway and what we plan to do. And I think it's also sort of important to state with clarity that regardless of what happens in this body, this will continue to be an area of strategic focus for the agency.
And if I could just respond to one thing that you just said. Everything that that we know is important has been happening in I don't want to say in pockets of the AOE, but maybe in a manner that's challenging to see as a whole. And so we do know of some initiatives where we are looking at those elements of the district management group and supporting students on IEPs and all students who struggle, and looking at data to see how effective we're being.
And I think integration within to the agency's strategic plan
And
that you all know is
Yeah.
under development, right? So how do we move from pockets and silos within the agency and in the field, right? This is
Yeah.
work that's underway in the field to greater or lesser extent, right? Improving classroom instruction is work that districts can do, right? Improving their scheduling, work that districts can do, and some are underway with this, right? So how do we actually, through strategic planning within the agency, bring this work together and really prioritize and resource it in a way where we can implement with fidelity and rigor? I think that's something you're pointing to, is we're trying to evaluate something that's midstream. And so how do we identify clear, measurable goals, implement them with fidelity and rigor, and measure, right? That is something you've heard from us multiple times, I think probably every session that we've walked in the door. This is work that's underway, right? And it's not a flip the switch, but a lot of the groundwork has been laid and a lot of the work is already happening. How do we bring coherence and quality control to it and measure?
So Representative Brady has something. Representative Holcomb, I'm going to ask you if it's okay to hold for a couple minutes, and I'm going to try to give you a chance to get through more of your presentation.
I have probably a more nuts and bolts question, and then kind of really appreciate what you just said about work that's midstream. So if I go back to the census block grant advisory group that has been, in their final reported recommendations, we've been getting updates for as long as I've been in the legislature. One of the recommendations was a clear mechanism for ongoing monitoring and support of MTSS implementation.
Yes.
Much of what we've been, is it fair by understanding that that doesn't entirely exist yet?
So it doesn't exist, statewide. And also, there's a really great initiative that's happening. And I would be happy to talk about it because I'm the director of it, the State Personnel Development Grant. Have me back. The Vermont's multi-tiered system support framework is probably something you've heard about. We talked about it several times, right? Megan Roy was one of the authors of that. Making that something that we can measure how well districts are doing to that did not happen immediately after Act 170. We went with those systems levers, which were part of the education quality standards. So anyway, Measuring how well a system at a district level, school level, classroom level is able to achieve that framework is critical. It'd be very helpful for us. Agreed.
I guess I appreciate your comments, Chair Kornheiser, and, you know, your characterization too. I think it's not a surprise. I guess I almost just want to call out, like, I think we're all wrestling a lot in this moment with things that we have tried to do. And I'm bringing this up because I can see we're about to jump to the next, you know, slide in the transformation proposal. And so I'm sort of trying to wrap my brain around, you know, to what extent do we put more change on a system for good purposes? And we might disagree a little bit about what some of those are, but I think there's a lot of broad agreement about changes needed. And how does that potentially endanger big systems work and reform that has existed? And the implementation is hard for a lot of reasons and is longer, and the legislature has a short attention span. I certainly own that. And COVID played a huge role, but the implementation of and the potential for Act 173, I share Chair Conlon's really, you know, believe in it strongly. And it feels like such important unfinished work. There's nothing more critical to improving our system than improving core instruction. And so I'm a little worried about our some of the degree and level or speed of the transformation pieces in some ways continuing to put a real roadblock on work that is underway, that is really important, that has maybe been slower for a variety of reasons.
I don't see them as being separate, but I might, you know, just not trying to be contrary. I think that improving core instruction means many of the things that we've been talking about. And I just have a couple of things on this slide that we've heard Secretary Saunders and Zoe and Jill talk about. I bulleted out how they relate to 173 and those, like, they're good best practices because they're the best practices, right? And so I don't see this as we're shifting gears away from one thing to another thing. I see it as this is the through line and this is where we are now. And this looks like the way that we're going to really see movement in the way that we would have hoped that we would have seen movement back in 2018. The data, the educator preparation, I put bullets in here about supporting effective master schedules. One of the elements of our MTSS framework is around effective collaboration. But we know that kids need time for their instruction. The educators, the adults need time. It needs to be sacred. It needs to be protected. I'm sure if you know a teacher, you know that they do some of their best talking with their colleagues in the hallway. It can't be the case. And ensuring that there's equitable access to other service providers. So all of those are ensuring. How are we doing that? I think that's the thing that we have to be able to say, here is the plan. That's our strategic plan. And then in a year, we'll be able to say, here's how we did against that. I do not think we had this setup, this type of intentionality in 2018, 2019. But I do agree that it's the same work.
I totally agree with you. I guess I'm concerned about that through line and the capacity of if, you know, these are recommendations from the statewide group 2 years ago around some pretty specific things just for MTSS monitoring and support and intervention. And if we haven't been able to, or if the agency hasn't been able to fully actualize that, that was 2 years ago, but now we're talking about much bigger. I worry about, you know, the capacity of the agency to implement the level of change. And then, of course,
I see.
You know, the impact on the field and instability is not good for kids or systems. So I'll leave it at that.
And I think a couple of quick comments there. I actually think that's a really fair concern to raise, and I appreciate it. I think that there are systems level barriers that exist because of the challenges of our scale at every level of the system. So whenever I'm talking about scale, I mean everybody, right? And I do think that our districts have articulated, we've talked about this a lot, so I don't want to sort of beat a dead horse here, but we've talked about the challenges of being able to hire and staff, right? We know that we have a really increasing number of educators on provisional and emergency licenses. So we have simultaneously this like workforce shortage, but also these very small class sizes, right? So we've talked about scale issues. And if what we know is the number one most important lever that we could pull, where we should drive our efforts, it's highly qualified general classroom instructors and instruction, then we've got something to solve there, right? So increasing numbers of folks on provisional licenses, the challenges of finding and hiring highly qualified special educators so that we're not as reliant on paraprofessionals who are doing, are dedicated, but not necessarily the highly qualified individuals, right? So there are some fundamental barriers here that our scale of our system creates. So I do think we have to address that because we can only go so far. And that's just something we have to recognize. I would also say it's really important to not underestimate the value of having a strategic plan for an agency. It drives work, it drives resources. We have not had one. We have to sort of acknowledge that. We are doing that work right now. We will have a strategic plan. It will drive resources. It will drive priorities. This is one of the core elements of our strategic plan. So I think that's critical to recognize. And then I think the third thing is, as we were developing the transformation proposal, which I'm hoping we can continue to improve, right? And be thinking about this and measuring goals like this against the proposal and how might we change it, right? How might we improve it? But as we were developing that transformation proposal, we looked across the sort of unfinished initiatives and we said that was a priority. The state said it was a priority, right? Improving instruction for students with additional needs was a critical priority. Okay, what are some of our barriers to achieving that, right? There are other initiatives that I think of as either work underway or just work that wasn't ever fully implemented with rigor and fidelity across the whole system. So when we were developing this proposal, it also included a look at sort of the work that the state has said, this is important, this is something that we want to do. What are some of our barriers to doing it? So I thank you for your comment. I think it's a really valid one. It's the comment of someone in the classroom, right? Who is most concerned about disruption to education. And that's something that, we also are thinking about a lot.
Okay, so right before I turn it over to our state director of special ed, the last piece is that how the AOE is supporting districts and schools. And you didn't mention it, but one of the other things that frequently comes up as something that folks wished had gone better was the AOE's ability to provide on the ground technical support or training when Act 173 first came out. The AOE does provide lots of technical assistance, and right now our Education Quality Assurance Division works directly with those systems that are in need of comprehensive supports that came under our ESSA plan. And I'm going to transition now and let Cassie Santo, our State Director of Special Ed, talk about what we're doing specifically around providing special education technical assistance.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Meg. I might not be able to answer all the questions coming through today, and I don't think I'm going to answer why 173 might not be fully actualized. I've been in my role for a few months, and I have been on this team for several years, and I'm going to share with you guys how we support the field currently and some ways in which we are improving our systems to better serve the field. We always have our universal technical assistance, which is some of what Meg was just referencing. We have multiple individuals that might respond to questions from the field and questions from community members, and that technical assistance line is always available throughout the year. Within the Student Support Services Division, which Meg is the director of, we offer professional development that is focused on multi-tiered systems of support, 504s, ESTs, early childhood special education, and other general special education topics like eligibility, and then also continued trainings about the rule changes, which fully took place in July 2023. So when we think about the data, to someone's question earlier about data points, we only have data up until 2022, 2023, and the rule changes fully went into effect in 2023. Just wanted to make sure to note that. We also release guidance and tools to support the work of the field, and those are the universal supports that are made available to LEAs. In addition to our universal technical assistance, which happens within our technical assistance team, we also have a special education monitoring team. And so in a healthy system, the monitoring in special education should be proactively identifying gaps in practice and informing the agency's overall technical assistance and professional development so that we're able to target our work to address some of those observed gaps. Our monitoring system in the special education team has needed revision, and that has been a point of focus for our team over the past several months. We partnered with the National Center for Systemic Improvement and the IDEA Data Center. Those are both OSEP-funded technical assistance centers to help us as we think through our current monitoring processes and how we can rewrite these processes to leverage change at the district level and support that change. We are in the rewriting process now, and I'm going to introduce some of the items that we are working on. We are implementing a differentiated cyclic monitoring process. Monitoring is something that all LEAs have to engage in. They are assigned a cohort, and then they have set years that they are up for special education monitoring. We are going to be shifting how we monitor starting in August 2025. And what this means, in really in some more simple language, hopefully, is that we are creating a risk assessment that we will use to help us to determine what type of monitoring a district might need based on the data points that we have. And then we would be determining if we would conduct a standard monitoring review or a more intensive monitoring review. The risk assessment would look at several data points that will hopefully give us some information about an LEA's level of need across their entire system. And we're really trying to look at this holistically to some of the points that my colleagues have made on this call. Often, if a district is showing struggles within their special education practices, it is a sign of problems throughout the greater system. So depending on the results of a risk assessment, LEAs might have standard monitoring, or they might have more intensive monitoring for their cyclic review. The details of those are still being discussed, but both types of reviews would include a file review component. And that would include a file review for students in independent schools within the sending LEA, because as we sort of talked about earlier, that is the responsibility of the LEA, and that is one way that we can tap into some of the monitoring at the independent school level. And then an intensive review will be a more in-depth review, and it could include a site visit. In response to recent guidance from the Office of Special Education Programs, the special education team has also been developing what sometimes is called off-cycle monitoring, so monitoring that happens outside of that cyclic cohort, and we're really calling that a due diligence review. This process encompasses how we respond to potential non-compliance at an LEA. So this could include when we hear about areas of concern through the media or through our technical assistance line or some other medium. It really gets at what do we do when we have a potentially credible allegation about an individual student or a system. So we are calling this process a due diligence review. It can be initiated at any time, and this is an avenue where districts might be monitored outside of their cyclic monitoring cohort. So whether it's a cyclic monitoring review or an off-cycle due diligence review, there is a potential for corrective action. And so in addition to all of this, we are focused on building out individualized corrective action aligned to support need. This summer, we are hosting professional development for the field during the pre-weeks in August, and we have invited staff from across the agency to collaborate in an effort to unite our messaging and strengthen instruction and learning for all students. This work in this conversation, as we've sort of identified, I wrote that it has to be an agency-wide effort, but in some ways it's even bigger than an agency-wide effort. And our team is really trying to build the foundation to de-silo special education and to find opportunities to work with schools in a way that can better their entire system. Students on IEPs are Vermont students first, and special education is a service designed to support students with disabilities in accessing and succeeding in the general education curriculum. So when we consider the results of special education monitoring, individualized corrective action, and then how those items might support legislation like Act 173, we are no longer just talking about special education. Our system and special education is a part of that whole. All students might encounter academic challenges at some point during their life as a student. And Act 173 really aimed to enhance the effectiveness, availability, and equity of services for each and every student. So I know you guys know that, but just wanted to make that point again. And so therefore on our team, the corrective actions and the professional development that we offer to schools has to really focus on improving the broader educational system to better serve all students. Thank you, guys. I'm happy to answer any questions that I might be able to weigh in on here.
And one thing I would add, just as sort of a general comment, again, sort of thinking about how we transform the system top to bottom to really improve the quality of educational delivery. One thing that we've talked about that is an issue of scale is that many of our districts are really having to focus on compliance, right? Really just being able to be meeting the sort of minimums of compliance and not necessarily having the resources available to be able to like really do those activities to improve instruction, right? And so we want to move out of that collectively. We want to move out of that. We want to move out of it as an agency as well, right? And Secretary Saunders has talked many, many times about ensuring that we have the right level of expertise at the right level of this system, right? And so, you know, that is a challenge that is partially addressed by having larger districts, whatever that larger scale is, right? We've been able to articulate with our proposal how you might staff that at the district level, but that doesn't mean that you cannot achieve scale at some other, you know, kind of organizational structure. It's really challenging right now. And this goes across not just special education, but sort of all of sort of the functions of central offices. We have very few districts that are operating at a level where they can really be, you know, working to do that professional development and improve those instruction practices and have teacher mentors and have, we hear a lot from principals who are like, I don't get to be an education leader. I'm doing administrative and compliance stuff all day, right? So how that is partially an issue of scale. It's partially an issue of the agency being better positioned to provide the kinds of support that the field is asking for. We heard that really loud and clear. We really documented that through the listen and learn when we were talking to education leaders and educators, is they want to see us on the ground partnering with them. And then they also need to have the capacity to do that work. There's only so many hours in the day, right? And so I want to sort of address that as well, is how do we move beyond, we need to bring everybody into compliance, right? Everyone needs to be doing what they're supposed to be doing, but how do we actually make some movement to really improve the quality of instruction for everyone and make sure that it's across the board, right? Again, we know we have some systems that are doing well in this and are making gains, but it has to be for everyone. And there are just some system level barriers. And Meg, you actually talk about 173 a lot as like, this was about systems, right? So yes, it is about classroom instruction. Yes, it is about master scheduling, but it's also about the systems that are are sort of necessary to be able to do this work. It's challenging work.
Yeah, so I think, we all know that scale is a problem, and I don't think that's unique to Vermont's education system. I think it's a broader Vermont problem. Housing, when we talk about workforce, like there are just scale issues because there are approximately as many people in the state as in the city of Boston, spread out over an entire state. But when we're talking about, student services, when we're talking about outcomes, looking back at the slide about the current education transformation proposal, it talks about improving academic proficiency through effective accountability. It talks about supporting things like the master schedule. Not that those things aren't important, but it seems to me that when we have budgets passing that are cutting staff, when we're hearing from folks on the ground that they can't keep up with the work that they already need to do, when we know that, it's personnel costs in terms of healthcare costs that is largely a driver for why we're spending so much on education. I'm struggling to see how helping with scheduling, providing mentors for new teachers and, effective accountability solves the problem of we just don't have enough people in our schools to support our students' current needs. And so I'm really trying to, match those two things together in a way that works. Just having a hard time.
So I think that part of our contention is, I think we should ask that question. Is that the case, that we do not physically have enough adults in our school buildings to meet our needs?
It is in my district.
And that's part of the problem, right? And we've actually really talked about that in our highest needs districts, those are the places where the cuts are happening the most. That is absolutely part of why that move to a different foundation formula approach would result in an equitable distribution of resources for some of our highest needs communities. We know that those are the communities that are not funding to the same level as our other communities are. I think also what we've talked about, and Nate, I might, heads up, Nate, I might call on you right now. You are doing something else. What we have been exploring, and we have actually worked with Nate Levinson on this because for two reasons. One is that he's been working in the Vermont system for a really long time and has directly worked with districts around how they staff and schedule. And so he can sort of speak to this at a level of detail that I cannot, despite my work with business managers and superintendents over the past few years. The other piece of this is that Nate was really heavily involved with special education and 173 and that work as well. So Nate, I'm wondering if you can speak to a little bit some of the concerns that were just raised around how do we do this work to support all students, but in particular students on IEPs or students who need additional support. And at the same time, how do we do it in sort of the funding system that we are proposing and with the budgets?
Sure, great questions. Good morning. So a couple thoughts, and I think these are interconnected. So I think the first thing I'd put out is, were you to implement Act 173 fully, oddly enough, you will need fewer adults, folks with more higher skill levels. So one is, it is an interesting thing that it is actually less adult intensive than current practices. Second is, and I know people have talked about scale in a couple different ways, implementing the change in practices. And these are changes in mindsets and changes in practices. It takes about as much leadership management and effort to change the practices in a district with 500 students, 1,000 students, or 10,000 students. And I say that from somebody who has helped change these practices in many hundreds of districts. So I do think that as the number of districts come down, it would be easier to bring these changes to fruition. But I think the other thing that's also really important is getting a larger number of schools under the same leadership. And as we've talked a lot about some of the changes that might come about with budgeting, is in a world of small schools, you're going to need to be able to share staff and coordinate staff across multiple schools. And I just want to give you one kind of very simple benchmark to think about. In states, and we've led a lot of work in Louisiana, who has enacted essentially exactly Act 173 under a different name. And they have seen the best in the nation outcomes for students with disabilities. But as they were mapping out the staffing for that, for example, there's a greater role in both Act 173 as there is in Louisiana for reading teachers. This is what Meg was talking about, the intervention early, quickly of highly skilled teachers, that extra time for kids, in this case, struggling to read. In Louisiana, they assume one full-time reading teacher would help about 30 students. Some districts will get that to 35. As we have worked in Vermont with school systems trying to do this, you will typically have to set an expectation of about that same FTE helping about 15 students, not 30 or 35. Given small school systems, reluctance to share, or an inability to share across multiple schools. So it does seem that the current lack of scale also drives a need for more of these highly skilled folks.
If I could follow up on.
Sure.
So I think what I'm struggling with is that I understand the concept of achieving scale and streamlining processes will theoretically result in less, labor hours, for lack of a better term, which could then reduce total amount of FTEs needed. But when we're living in a world when, students' needs, families' needs, community needs are getting more complicated, not less. And we're already being told that we don't have enough people. That's what we're hearing from our schools or from our school boards, that they don't have enough resources, people and money. I think what Mr. Levinson just laid out works great if we're assuming that student needs are going to plateau, stay the same, et cetera, not get worse. I'm looking at, we talked about the national picture earlier, we're looking at income inequality, we're looking at increasing poverty, hunger. I don't see a world where those needs are going down. And so to say that, those needs are going to increase, but just trust us, we're gonna require less work, which will require less people. That's just really hard to square.
So we're not saying trust us. We're showing, right? We're showing the data, but I want us to continue to challenge the assumption. I would agree with you if we were delivering highly effective services right now, right? If we were optimal and the need was continuing to grow, then I would say, you're right. We need more resources because the need is continuing to grow and we have maxed out the efficiency and effectiveness. I think effectiveness is critical here. I think what we're saying is that the data and analysis, qualitative and quantitative, that we have done is showing us that we have not achieved that. So I don't in any way disagree with you that we're seeing student need increase. I fully agree with that. But I am encouraging us to question whether or not more bodies, more adults is the first solution when we have not yet really done the work of ensuring that we're effective in our existing delivery of services. And one of those places that, I think we should continue to talk about is things like class sizes. We do objectively have the smallest class sizes in the nation. We should be talking about that. How does that choice that we have made, it is a choice, resulted in maybe a diversion of resources to other parts of the school system? that could support students in a different.
And I think one of the things that's helpful about having really good data when you are able to bring it is we are able to look across the state and see the significant differences between a district like Barry and
Yeah.
another district. So
Are you
Representative
saying in
Burkhart,
terms of class sizes or in terms of like?
pretty much writ large across the board, the massive differences between our districts, I think is not always entirely available to people as information when we're not able to see sort of the best quality data. So Representative Burkhart, do you have something?
Sorry,
And
if you get specific about what you're needing,
Yep.
that would be helpful rather than a broad statement because we've provided hundreds of pages.
Thank
So
you.
what is it that's needed to drive the conversation forward would be really helpful to get.
Representative Burkhart, and then I think Representative Dunlap's gonna wrap this up.
Yeah, I'm just really struggling to understand what you feel is missing from the implementation of 173, because I come from a district, having been on the board of that district during implementation of MTSS, and it's a district that's at scale, like has class sizes of 25, in the upper grades, and has class sizes of 15 in the lower grades, sometimes more than that, talking like 19 or 20, second graders crammed in the classroom with all their different needs. And we invested really heavily in MTSS, like really put a lot of work into it, spent lots of hours at the board level, lots of hours of staff time. And still the number of IEPs, the number of needs for additional adults based on those IEPs, because that's what we're struggling to figure out is how do you meet those IEPs without additional adults? Because the needs, as Teddy was saying, still seem to grow, even in a district that's really heavily invested and feels like they've implemented MTSS. The statistic this year in that district was that 55% of the budget increase that they were looking for from the community was coming from special education, like extraordinary special education needs. And so I'm not criticizing Act 173. I'm just trying to square the circle, if you will, if that was sort of meant to be how we were going to get to a place where we needed fewer bodies. Like, why isn't that working even in a district that is at scale and that has tried to implement it? And I don't know how to make that into a data request, but I'm just trying to understand that. And I would push back a little bit on it's the districts with the highest needs that are making the biggest cuts, because I work with two districts in my representative district represents two districts that are at scale, and both of them have had to make, one made giant cuts to FTEs and actually managed to cut back their budget this year. The other one has cut FTEs and still has a growing budget, partly because of special education expenses, partly because of healthcare and other things that are driving up the budget. But I just wanted to put that out there because I'm just really struggling if we're still sort of focused on 173 as the way to get to fewer bodies. If it's not working in these example districts, how do we make that work across a bigger system?
Before you respond,
Please.
I'm going to respond to the last thing you said first. I think that we've actually been very clear that what we see as sort of the future state of our system, if we don't make change, whatever that change may be, is that everyone will be faced with the decision to cut. So that's not what we've said. What we've said and what the data shows very clearly is that the result of our current education funding system is that our highest needs communities are spending less per student than our better resourced communities. So when we're talking about, did you have a question? I'm sorry.
I feel like it's not responsive.
So I'm going to finish my sentence. So when we're talking about cuts across districts, I agree with you. We know that districts were able to hold the line this year by making incredibly painful cuts, sometimes to highly effective programs, not the places that we would want to see those cuts. No one in this room is saying that we would want to see cuts to highly effective teachers and programs that support students. That's actually the entire point of the education transformation. What we are signaling is that the existing inequities in our system are going to be exacerbated because already those under-resourced communities are already spending less per student. And when they are making cuts, they are making cuts to entire programs, right? For our highest needs students. The inequities are going to continue to grow. So I just want to be really clear because we are not saying that and we never have. We recognize that If we continue with our current system, the only choice that districts have to maintain their current level of spending or to maintain their current level of spending growth is to cut. That's actually fundamental to what we brought from the very first day when we were talking about education transformation. We looked across the system and we said, this is what the future looks like. So I just want to be very clear about that. I don't want any mischaracterization of what the agency has said many, many times over the past few months. And it's a bad situation to be in. Nobody wants that situation. It's why we feel the urgency to make change this session. It's why we have presented something big this session with the hope that we can work together to refine it and improve it. And then Meg, I'll let you speak to the sort of assertion that 173 is not cutting staff, because I don't think that's what it's about.
No, and you know, like Nate's what Nate just said about how that when the system is running optimally, we would expect to see education be able to happen with fewer adults, is an outcome, I think. So for me and what we try to say at the education, the Agency of Education, is that when we talk about a multi-tiered system of support, to us, it's a framework. And not the part of it that makes sure that students get what they need in a timely way. So hopefully there's using data to intervene on a student's behalf proactively, not waiting for a student to fail. That's a sliver of what teachers, what we say when we're in the classroom around our multi-tiered system of support. I looked at some test scores. I see a bunch of kids who are having a struggle with the same thing. I'm going to put them together and I'm going to reteach it. So that's an element of a multi-tiered system of supports. But 173, that idea was, it's the framework for how districts and schools and classrooms do what they do. So it's bigger than, so I think that the answer to, in my district, we are implementing MTSS, why isn't it working? Then the question needs to be a little bit different, but I'm positive there's an answer there. It's part of that continuous improvement. I'm going to try not to sound like I'm rambling. But I wonder if there are ways to look at that district's data to get to what that is. And when you say they're implementing MTSS, what are those things that they're doing well? What are the things that still need to be addressed in their system, how they're leveraging their framework?
I'm gonna probably
Sorry, yeah.
stop there because folks are having to wander out. I think maybe just to wrap up, I might reiterate what Nate Levinson said at our last gathering in this room, which is that a program like Act 173, and I would say for any major transformation changes, it needs sustained support over a number of years, like 5 minimum, in order to be successful. And I think that gets a message that we all need to keep in mind as we move forward.
And without a pandemic happening 2 years into it.
I understand.
It's also helpful.
At a certain point, we're going to stop it. All right, we'll wrap there. Have a good lunch, everybody. Thank you all for your time, and those of you who joined us via video.